Thank you all for joining us tonight. My name is Carrie, and I am with the programming team at the library. And we are really happy tonight to have Alan Neigher back with us for the second in our third sort of series around the Constitution. We talked about the shaping of the Constitution, I guess, about a couple months ago.
Yes.
Tonight, we will be, Alan will be talking about the writing of the Constitution, and then hopefully an actual live person event in the fall, he's going to finish up with the ratification and the Bill of Rights, and for our final event in this series. So we're really happy to have you.
Recommending to Fairfield something on the Constitution and the Bill of Rights.
Fairfield just doesn't do it.
No.
Just a little bit of housekeeping. If you wouldn't mind keeping yourself muted during the event, that would be great, just so that Alan has a chance to talk. We're going to have plenty of time for questions, and feel free to write your questions either in the chat or the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen as well. So I don't think he needs much of an introduction. I'm sure all of you are familiar, but Alan Neigher has been practicing law in Westport since 1980, and he specializes in entertainment law and intellectual property law. And we're just really happy to have him back tonight to share this, this talk with you. So Alan, I'm going to turn it right over to you.
Thanks so much, Carrie. And thanks to you and Susan Heller again for your valuable help in providing images that people can look at other than my face for the next half hour. When we met last time, we talked about the classical influence, Roman Greek classical influence on the United States. We showed a map of the colonies. We have that up, Carrie, and we talked about the size of the United States. There's our map. And if you look at the northernmost points and the southernmost points, when you figure it took 2 days to get from Bridgeport to Hartford, you know how much distance was involved in getting to Philadelphia. And there's King George, no longer our monarch. We are free of a king after the Revolution. And we had the Articles of Confederation. We also had Shays' Rebellion in the winter of 1786 into the spring of 1787. Very influential matter for purposes of the Constitution. So the Articles of Confederation had been in effect since 1781. Our founding fathers thought that this was probably the best way to kick off the country. By the end of 84, 85, it became clear that we didn't have a nation. We had a confederation of supposed friendship. The states were hardly friendly to each other. The states were fighting over trade and commerce. They were fighting over boundaries between themselves. They were fighting over creation of new states from the vast Western provinces. The states were acting a lot like European principalities without a common purpose. We had gone from being under one of the most powerful governments in the world to one of the weakest. Each state retained its own sovereignty over everything except foreign affairs and treaties. And the Confederation, when they did meet in Philadelphia, rarely got to making any decisions. Each state had one vote. You needed 9 or 10 or 11 votes, depending on the quorum, to pass anything. It was clear that we had a very, very weak government, and it was pecking away at the visions of the founding fathers. We had no executive, no national executive. We had no national judiciary. All we had was the Confederate legislature. The overarching sentiment by the time we got to the end of 1786 was Ben Franklin's let's mend what's broke attitude. So the Constitutional Convention that had been scheduled for Annapolis, Maryland in '86 met without a quorum, but Hamilton and John Adams made it very clear that there would be a convention in Philadelphia the following year to begin May 14th, 1786. Philadelphia was a pretty advanced city, certainly ranking with New York and Boston. It had a state house. It had Independence Hall, where the Declaration of Independence had been signed. It had beautiful homes, including those of Ben Franklin and George Washington. It had been the designated place of assembly for this convention. And while the convention was scheduled to begin on May 14th, you needed a quorum of 7 states. And between May 14th and May 27th of 1787, they didn't have a quorum. They just met in the local taverns and exchanged good thoughts about what might be coming. But here is a critical point and a takeaway. Very few of the delegates to the convention had any idea of what a strong national government meant. They were essentially libertarians in the sense that they came from small town meetings. They distrusted a monarchy, classic Roman Empire thoughts and Greek Empire thoughts were becoming passé. Only one person had thought of what was lying ahead and what to do. And again, as I said in our last meeting, there was nobody to compare with James Madison. Madison had buried himself during the summer and the winter of 86 and going into 87, buried in books at his parents' home in Virginia. And he had studied every conceivable constitution in every language because he was multilingual, including the constitution of King Gustav of Sweden, who had put together a pretty interesting constitution. The problem was that it was a monarchical constitution. There were everything revolved around the royal family in Sweden, and Switzerland had a new constitution, a little difficult with the cantons. Madison had reflected and spoken frequently with George Washington and with Edmund Randolph, and they had decided that the government that they needed to put together, above all else, had to be strong. There were foreign forces, England, France, the Netherlands, Holland, Spain, and Portugal, all ocean-going powers. The United States was by no means a military power in 1787. So Madison had decided, after long discussions with Edmund Randolph, that there should be a strong central government, and it should have 2 powers to make things happen and a power of negative influence over the states. Madison believed that without the power to veto or to set aside state laws that were inconsistent with the federal government, its role, its legislation, its executive orders, and its judicial orders, that the new republic would not work. So this is a radical position. And Madison and Edmund Randolph had made plans before the convention.
Very few of the participants.
I'm sorry, I'm getting feedback. How am I doing? Hello? No. Okay.
You're back. Alan, we can hear you. You're back.
Can you? Okay.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Okay. So Madison.
Hang on one second, Alan. It looks like you are muted again. Something. There you go. Okay, we're good. Yep.
Okay. Again, I'll repeat. Virginia, the Virginia plan, strong national legislature of 2 houses, a strong national executive, and a national judiciary. All new stuff. Hadn't been thought of before. So we get to May 27th, and 2 states dribble in, and we have a quorum, 7 states. The first thing that Madison did with Edmund Randolph was provide a framework of the Virginia plan with the 3 branches of government. The primary thought was that there would be 2 houses of the Congress. There were those among the delegation who just loved the idea of the House of Lords in England and wanted only that. Roger Sherman was the first person to speak on what would a legislature look like if we had 2 houses. Roger Sherman, our own Roger Sherman, the inn in New Haven, the former mayor of New Haven, the man who had been to hundreds of town meetings, announced that people should have little to do with government. The national legislature should be chosen by state legislators. Sherman, who had been a prominent local politician in Connecticut, was now speaking in ways that were not exactly Republican. And then we come to Elbridge Gary, governor of Massachusetts, the man who had to put down Shays' Rebellion in Western Pennsylvania. You'll recall that Shays' Rebellion was a concerted and 7-month-long battle by farmers in Western Massachusetts who were being foreclosed on their property. Why? Because they went off to fight the revolution. They didn't have any money, and the banks weren't giving them any credit. So they were being foreclosed. And what they did was they went to all the courthouses in Western Massachusetts, Springfield, Pittsfield, and barred people from entering so they wouldn't issue foreclosure notices. Governor Gary sent whatever he could find of militia in Boston to Springfield, where the Shays' Rebellion people had occupied the Springfield Armory. My cousin Roz's hometown, we just went by there the other day. It's a national landmark, and indeed it was, because there Elbridge Gary's troops killed 4 of the Shays' Rebellion people and carried with him a remarkable antipathy towards masses. What is what Governor Gary said: the people are daily misled into the most baneful measures and opinions by the false reports circulated by designing men. Wow. Sound like fake news? These gentlemen were merely property owners. The people at the convention were white, Christian, property owners. Maybe a few exceptions, not many. And for property owners, what was their biggest concern? That the mobs would come after their property. So Madison wanted popular election of both houses. Other delegates wanted state legislatures to pick both houses. And finally, after a lot of debate that went on during the first month of the convention, the delegates finally decided in Article 1 that there would be two houses of Congress. The House of Representatives would be elected by population of each state, and the Senate, and they started calling him the Senate, the Roman name, not the upper house, not the House of Lords, but the Senate would be elected by the various legislators. That was enough to strike a bargain between the Republican, smaller Republicans like Adams and Madison on the one hand, and men like John Dickinson and William Morris of Pennsylvania, who were much more, and Elbridge Gary, who were much more aristocratic in their views. Now, when they decided on two houses of Congress, one popularly elected, they had to decide on what would be the powers of Congress. Remember, these were delegates who had absolutely no intention of doing anything but tweaking the National Assembly, the Articles of Confederation, and wanted from a National Assembly a group that could be controlled, nothing wild. In the end, they ended up allocating under Article, where was it? Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, powers of Congress, which included post offices, post roads, collecting taxes, borrowing money on the credit of the United States, regulating Congress with the power to make war. At first they called it making war. Then they kind of toned it down. So now it's the power to declare war. Declare was an artful word that was debated over the course of the early months of the delegation. Now came the biggie. The biggie in the sense that the results of what happened over the selection of representatives in Congress has had and will continue to have a marked anchor around the neck of the body politic of the United States. As I said, one fraction of the delegations thought that both houses should be elected popularly, but that didn't pass. It didn't have very much support at all after Madison, Adams, and a couple of others. So the view expressed primarily from the South was proportion the House of Representatives not only on population, but on wealth. Wealth. What was their wealth? Slaves. And to the Southern delegates, the concept of having a slave was a sign of wealth that contributed to the economy of the United States. The debates are notable on this point for the absence of any condemnation of slavery. Instead, the debate centered on pure power. Those from the South thought that slaves constituted wealth and that a slave was worth the what a free white man in the North would be worth. North Carolina delegate offered a compromise. And he said, let's make a deal. Let's have slaves count as 3/5 of a free person for purposes of apportionment. They knew they were going to have a census that was going to be later provided in the Constitution. But, we don't have all that many people down here, and we're not going to have all that many people in the House of Representatives. We have to get we have to populate. And so they argued for the 60% rule, a 3/5 rule. The delegates spent most of the weekend in July, 2 months after the convention started, arguing over how to do this. And out of this came the Great Compromise. James Madison, coming from a slave-owning plantation in the South, but he had absolutely no love for the institution of slavery and its consequences. He argued vociferously against the 3/5 rule, as he would against other rules that compromised the rights of slaves. And the Great Compromise was just that. After they debated it, they came out and said, okay, 3/5 of each slave, whether man, woman, or child, would count as wealth and count as population for the South. The Great Compromise was passed because, remember, Rhode Island never showed up at the convention. They were never there. New York and I think New Hampshire didn't have a quorum for under their own rules, and one other state didn't participate yet. So you had 9 states voting on the Great Compromise, and it went 5-4 to accept it. Connecticut, New Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland found an ally in North Carolina. The compromise allowed Southern states to count slaves as 3/5 of a person for purposes of House seats. Now, the convention then moved to the question of importation of new slaves. Connecticut's Roger Sherman, wanting to put the slavery debate behind the convention, proposed allowing the southern states to continue importing slaves forever. Oliver Ellsworth of Connecticut was deaf to moral appeals on slavery, and he said, let us not intermeddle and be unjust to the states whose commerce depended on slavery. This is on top of Northern delegates who wanted slavery to go on forever. And finally, after referral to committees, and the Constitutional Convention referred to committees of the whole or committee on postponed matters, and generally the committee recommendations passed. And this committee submitted a proposal that the importation of slavery would end in 13 years. The entire convention, hearing buzzing and objecting from Southern delegates, said, okay, we'll extend it to 1808, no further. And Madison objected vociferously and to no avail. So the legacy of the Great Compromise. This issue in the debate of slavery has affected the nature of our union for well over 200 years. It's affected the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judiciary. It's affected the federal courts, the presidency, and virtually every aspect of our life. And the legacy of that is being felt every day, no later than 5 o'clock today in Minneapolis. So the momentous decisions made by the convention were, and the takeaway with respect to Article 1, as no great fight over slavery, over the institution of slavery, that the Northern representatives, the Northern delegates, including our own Roger Sherman and Elbridge Gary, Roger Sherman and Ellsworth were nowhere near what you would call anti-slavery. And the institution was effectively written into the Constitution at that stage. Okay. Kerry, we're at 4, the executive, Randolph, the assemblage, and Madison. The issue of the executive branch was similarly fraught. There were those who wanted a strong federal executive in any format. And there were those localists who liked the local town meeting and thought that each city ought to have its own sovereignty. We don't want any big government hanging over our heads. That debate has never stopped. It will continue every time you go to a town meeting in Connecticut, anytime you go to hear a debate on C-SPAN. That's a holdover from the Roman Empire and the Roman Republic. So the question was whether there should be a 3-person triumvirate for an executive, which was debated for a long period of time. Edmund Randolph of Virginia said to the convention, one man equals the fetus of monarchy. It took June 1st until July 15th before the delegates resolved on a single chief executive. He wasn't called president until they actually wrote the language in. How long should it serve? Single term? 4 years, 5 years, 6, 7 years? Unlimited terms? How to elect them? Again, we had the aristocrats from the North primarily, but a few from the South. We don't want to let the masses pick our chief executive. Well, we're going to leave it to the states. Their legislatures will decide. We'll give them the votes according to their representation in Congress, and of course, the Electoral College, something that you've heard about all of last year and well before that. So, on late into September, just before the adjournment, the various committees settled on one chief executive elected every 4 years without term limits, you'll recall, that the chief executive would be the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. He would be able to enact treaties with the approval of 2/3 of the Senate, that there would be a vice president who would finish second in the vote. And of course, we know how happy Thomas Jefferson was to have Aaron Burr in his court. Aaron Burr had just enough time to shoot Alexander Hamilton in 1801. Is there a mute issue? Can anybody hear me? Hello?
Yep, you're okay. We can hear you. You're good.
Okay, good. Fine. And so therefore, at the end of August in 1876, we had established 2 prongs of our government. We had the Congress with 2 houses, and we had a chief executive. One of the houses was not elected by the people, and the executive was effectively not elected by the people. But we had the makings of an extremely strong central government. Okay. Judiciary. Big fight all through the convention. What kind of judiciary we have? Who will make the appointments? For 2 months, from July 21st until September 12th, no one mentioned judicial appointments. The powers of any courts were debated heavily. Who would have jurisdiction on matters of citizens between different states? What would happen in the event of disputes between different states? Who would have authority over laws passed by Congress? On August 27th, somebody from Connecticut did something good. William Johnson of Connecticut offered an amendment to give Superior Court jurisdiction arising under this Constitution and laws enacted by Congress. So, sort of vanilla flavored language, but look at the words again. Jurisdiction arising under this Constitution and the laws enacted by Congress. What would happen in the event that state laws or rules conflicted with the Congress? And in that sweeping concept and enacting Article 3 of the Constitution, the delegates enacted the Supremacy Clause. All acts of Congress are the supreme law of the land. And that was adopted September 12th and gave the Supreme Court a veto power over state and federal laws. The court has, as you know, over the years, stricken down hundreds of state and federal laws as contrary to the Constitution. Of course, the New Deal laws of FDR, when he threatened to pack the court back in 36. We've had Brown versus the Board of Education, nullifying a state practice of segregation, segregated schools. I remember the impeach Earl Warren signs that were prevalent late in the 50s. That was also a function of Article 3. And judicial activism, of course, has become a concept that's been bemoaned by both the left and the right. But that activism, at least the power to give the federal courts, the federal appellate courts, which were not enacted yet, they came later, into regions, and the U.S. Supreme Court power to nullify laws and regulations by both states, municipalities, and by the federal government, that court, judge inconsistent with the Constitution, gave 3 powerful branches of government for the first time in modern history. And that was because Madison and John Adams, who were really forward-thinking men, Madison and Adams foresaw that millions of immigrants would be coming to this vast new world, that they would need a government, they would need a strong government. The government would need to protect itself and its citizens, because the world was hardly stable at that point of life. We're only 4 years away from the French Revolution. So consequently, and by the way, if I said September 12th is the day of the signing out, my mistake, my bad. It was September 17th. Now, the signing. Constitution was signed on September 17th, and there were still enormous differences of opinion between the Federalists like Madison, Washington, Adams, Hamilton, and those who were termed then the localists, the people who distrusted large governments and powerful governments. And that schism caused the delegates, after they signed the Constitution on September 17th, Madison and Hamilton especially, John Jay, who was also a delegate from Virginia, realized then that they needed 9 states to ratify the convention. And it was far from clear that they would have those 9 states. There were a lot of people who were worried that the Constitution, as originally written and signed on September 17th, was or enabled a woefully powerful federal government, something that the early revolutionaries did not want. They didn't want a strong monarchical government. They were suspicious of the Federalists who wanted a government. That's what Madison gave us. Madison knew, and Adams knew, that you had to have checks on the government. And the tripartite checks, borrowed from numerous governments in existence, but put into a form that was unique for the United States, gave us what we have today, the initial Constitution. However, the next talk will be about what it took to get the Constitution ratified by 9 states. Remember, Rhode Island never showed up and didn't vote to ratify the Constitution until 9 states had already done so. So Rhode Island, in effect, signed on to a document it had no part at all in creating. That's a fascinating bit of history. Okay, so for this time, we have plenty of time for questions, and I am at your pleasure. Fire away.
Any questions for Alan? Feel free to unmute yourself and or just raise your hand and ask away.
Sure.
Alan, actually, I have a question to start. Can you talk a little bit about what the situation would have looked like without James Madison, since he was so influential in some of it?
I said at the top of the lecture that historians over the years have said without Madison and Randolph coming forward with the Virginia plan, which they handed out to all the delegates once they got to Philadelphia. So there was something to start with. It was like an agenda. Here, gentlemen, let's talk about this. What do you think about that? And that's what they were doing in the taverns when they weren't drinking and talking about other things. They talked very seriously about, well, a legislature, 2 houses, a chief executive, the judiciary. Well, yeah, judiciary might help. Remember that 2 years before, Madison had gone on a horseback riding trip to see his mentor, George Washington, and a bunch of other people from Delaware, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Maryland. And the problem was that they were all fighting over who had fishing rights and shellfish rights in the Chesapeake Bay and Potomac River. And they couldn't settle that. They couldn't settle at George Washington's house. They knew then that there has to be a way for a civilized country to resolve disputes. And they didn't then. They didn't the next year in Annapolis, which was the first destination for a constitutional convention, without a quorum ever showing up. And had it not been for Madison and his insistence that there be a convention agreed upon in Philadelphia with a year's notice in advance, and had he not gotten there with the Virginia plan, who knows what would have happened?
Alan?
Yes. Yeah.
You've talked about Madison and Adams and Jefferson and all these very thoughtful people who, thank heavens, put together that Constitution. If we were in that situation today, in 2021, is there anyone who has anywhere near the gravitas of those founders who we could turn to, other than Barack Obama, and say, yeah, this is a person who is thoughtful enough that might help design a government for us?
Putting aside the exigencies now of the extremism and the schism and paranoia of politics today, and I'm not even going to get into who's who. Are there enough thoughtful, moderate women and men today who could craft something out of whole cloth to create a free republic in this world if they had the chance? it's a wonderful question. We're struggling to try to feed, clothe, house our own people. 320 million people now, then maybe 12 or 15 million people, over a very narrow seaboard. Every state then, except Vermont, and Vermont wasn't even a state then. Every state was on the seaboard. What would have happened today in another country if we had to craft it? I don't know. The remarkable part, the most appealing part of history is sitting down and saying to yourself, what would have happened if Madison wasn't there? And what would have happened if Franklin, despite his reservations, he wanted a House of Lords, he wanted one house, but he was an affable person and he saw he was outvoted. And also, I should also say this about the convention. Bob, this is a little off from what you were saying, but I think it's important to note. One of the critical parts of the convention was its absolute insistence by Washington, Madison, everybody who was in charge of running it, was absolute secrecy about what went on. Madison sat at the front of the convention hall and took down notes, a few notes. When they were printed, there were 600 pages. They weren't printed until 1846, 4 years after Madison died. He was the last delegate. And why was that? Because Madison wanted no one to suffer because of what was said at the convention. People said wild things. I mean, there was no C-SPAN then. And there were no reporters sitting around. They were sitting in, Kerry, could we have the assembly picture one more time? Can you click it up?
Just give me 1 second. I got to pull up the slide again.
Yeah.
Give me 1 sec.
Any shot of the room.
All right. Yeah, hang on a second. Let me
Sure.
get to that. It's a big one.
Okay.
Whoop. There we go.
There we go. Okay. The windows were sealed. They were there from May 27th until September 17th in a Philadelphia summer with closed windows. Okay. Some men said some really stupid things. And there were a few delegates who were never recorded as uttering a word. But the secrecy of the convention and the ability of the delegates to stand up and say whatever came to their minds freely and openly was a treasured asset. And in this case, it worked. I don't think that it's possible to ever obtain secrecy from a publicly selected delegation like that ever again. But you can imagine what it was like in that room. Okay, what do we got? Any others? One question, I think I'm going to throw something out here. The issue of why the northern delegates, I mentioned Elbridge Gary and Roger Sherman, but there are others from the north, in Pennsylvania and Massachusetts, who are also resistant to popular elections. The fear of the masses, not only because of Shays' Rebellion, but because they kind of thought of themselves as a House of Lords. Meanwhile, the proponents, especially from the South, of popularly elected chief executive and the legislatures was much more apparent. Why was the North less or more reluctant to rely on pure democracy? And you finally found the answer reading a few of the books on the subject, and it was simply this. In the South, very few men voted. You had to be a landed or a landed person or person of some wealth, merchants, maybe clergy, but certainly plantation owners. And if the state of Virginia had 200 or 300 eligible voters for a legislature, it would have been a lot. Meanwhile, in the North, with working white men, there are way more people eligible to vote even then. You didn't have to have property to vote in Massachusetts or Connecticut, at least after a certain point. I don't know the dates, but it was much more Republican and easy to vote in the North than it was in the South. So we had a lot more voters there, and that's why men like Elbridge Gary and Roger Sherman were so reluctant to allow direct popular elections of the Senate and of the chief executive.
I have a question.
Please.
You mentioned the 3/5 compromise and the consequence we're still feeling today. Why did so few counties vote in that? Why were there folks that abstained? I think you mentioned only 9 participated.
Well, yeah, Jeremy, they not only abstained, but they positively said, keep your hands off. They didn't say it's a terrible institution and but we're going away. They said, this is the way it's done in the South. There was a popular acceptance. There was virtually no moral speeches or speeches on the morality of slavery in the entire convention. It was an accepted institution in the United States. England hadn't yet outlawed it, I don't believe. And certainly slavery was throughout the colonies of France, Belgium, Spain, of course, throughout the Caribbean. It was there. There was not worldwide, there was not nationwide objection or protest to the institution of slavery. Did I answer your question, son? Hello? Everybody there? Am I muted?
No, I think Jeremy went back on mute. Oh, he said I'm muted. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Thanks for that question, Jeremy. Anybody else? Anything coming in?
No, I think there's no more questions coming in. We're getting some silent applause. Yeah, no, that was great, Alan. Thank you so much again for this great talk. As I mentioned, and as Alan mentioned, we're going to complete the third, and at least in this series, on the Bill of Rights, the ratification of the Bill of Rights and the Federalist Papers. It's a date to be determined, but we are looking to do that in the fall and hopefully be back in person at the library, believe it or not.
It'll be great.
Yeah, so look out for that. And as always, it's such a pleasure to have you here, Alan, and your expertise. And I'd like to thank everybody for showing up. Feel free to send any questions or feedback my way, and I'll make sure it gets over to Alan too. And just want to thank everybody for coming tonight, and especially you, Alan. Thanks so much for putting together a really awesome presentation.
Thanks to you and Susan. That's great.
Great. Thanks so much.
Bye-bye, folks.
Bye, everybody. Thank you so much for coming.